How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How you doing today, man?
Good, yeah, just a lazy Sunday. How long have you been, how long have you, I'm just curious, what's the time frame of your normal stream? Is this like every Sunday? Is this how it works?
No, I usually do it around other people's availability, just because
Okay,
I'm not exactly like Joe Rogan, so I can't be very demanding. I feel like if I can
right,
find
yeah,
interesting people who are kind enough to give me their time, I sort of want to bend over backwards to do it at a time that works for them. So it's usually quite random. It's whenever people can do.
cool, yeah.
Yeah. So what are you up to? You said lazy Sunday, just hanging around. Are you in your? Do you live in a flat or what?
Yeah, I live in an apartment here in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did meet, right?
Have
Do
we
you
met?
do you remember? No, I could be
Where was
wrong. I'm
it?
pretty sure I met
Where
you
was it?
very briefly. I met you very briefly, I believe, one evening through Jacob Lyles.
Okay, I know Jacob.
Yeah. It was a few months ago. I was in town for a political science conference, and he invited
Huh.
me out, and he invited a few people. And I think I don't know. I could be wrong. I might be confusing you with someone.
Maybe it might have been I didn't recognize you because I expected you to have a British accent. Um, do you live in the UK?
I live in the UK. Yeah, that's right. But I'm an
Okay.
American.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's completely possible. Yeah, Jacob's a great guy. He's my friend. I know him.
Yeah,
So
it was
sorry
at
if I
like
don't remember you.
no, no, it's cool. It was like a little party thing, so there were a bunch of people. I wouldn't expect you necessarily to remember, but I think I remember. And
Wait a second. I do remember you.
okay,
Yes,
you
it
do.
was at the Kava bar.
Yes, that's right.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that was before I knew you from the internet.
Yeah, okay.
Um, okay, cool. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay, that was great. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you had to leave early, so we didn't get to chat very much. But yeah, now
Yeah,
we now
unfortunately,
now we can.
the power of the internet.
So cool, man. So maybe we could just jump right in and tell me, like, could you tell me a little bit about like when you first got the idea for Jacobite? Like, what was the like what's the whole idea behind Jacobite? Because a lot of people look at it and you have this slogan that it's like a post-political magazine, and then people read it.
Sure.
It's obviously got a lot about politics. It's
Right.
obviously
Yeah. Okay.
political in some sense, and I think some people are like, what is this all about? So maybe in your
Right.
own words,
It's
tell
one
us a
of. I
little bit about.
mean, yeah, the post-political thing. I mean, that's a term that's kind of like I don't know. I think that can be a Rorschach test because like you can just project so many things onto it, and so maybe it's not a great term to have because like when I'm working, let's say with a writer, and they use a cliche, I'm not a person that initially thinks cliche is bad. I actually think like the flight from cliche is itself a cliche. I think it was Roger Scruton that said that, but there's the cliche is bad when you're trying to use imagery because it doesn't evoke anything specific. Like the term I use, the example I use a lot is if you write like a fog rolled in. Well, once upon a time, that might have been like really evocative. That might have like forced your brain to get out of the groove and sort of like uh, go somewhere else and actually like knit together an image, but not anymore just because like, you've heard it a million times, so it's kind of been redshifted through so many brains that it means a million things to a million people. So I mean, I think it's kind of unavoidable, some terminology. So before I get into like what exactly I mean by post-political, I'll just start from the very beginning.
Please do.
Why it's called Jacobite and like where we got the idea. Jordan Bloom, or J. Arthur Bloom, you might know from Twitter. He's a very close friend of mine. We went to college together. Then he was my roommate in DC when we were there working. He was a journalist, and I was a journalist too. Um, and then he's a very smart guy. He has a very deep knowledge of history. And this was about 5 years ago. Um, and he was talking about the Jacobites, like the Jacobite uprisings. And I hadn't even heard of those, thanks to American education, I guess, at that time. And I was like, wait, you mean Jacobins? He's like, no, 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 Jacobites. They're in fact kind of like opposites of the Jacobins. I'm like, okay. And then like later it'd be fun, like I think there's a different time we were talking about like a Jacobin magazine article. I think it's actually pretty good. They do good work. Like it's usually pretty restrained, analytical, informative. They have a lot of very stupid stuff too. So like anything else. However, so then I was like, we should make like a Jacobite magazine. And so it's just kind of like as things tend to do, it just kind of like from that little grain, it became its own thing. Um, we sort of spitballed the idea around for a while, then just tried to get a little bit of money together to pay some initial writers, pay a web developer. And yeah, so I mean, a lot of people interpret it as like a riff on like Jacobin, which it really isn't exactly. It's kind of just like what I described. It's like,
Yeah, they think that because they've never heard of Jacobites.
right.
Like you
Yes.
said.
Yeah. Right. But you know, we're not really trying to be like the evil twin of them or anything like that. We're not trying to do anything like that. We're kind of, I don't know. And so it's really two things. It's one, it's kind of like trying to capture this very nebulous intellectual current that maybe would be well described as post-political, which I'll dig into that a bit in a moment. Maybe described as something else, but kind of some kind of like, you know, this strange and embryonic thing that's like the dissident right, perhaps the dissident intellectual right, like, and these people are the sort of like not disenfranchised, but they're kind of like the forgotten child. You know, they don't really have like any prize fighters, any like, you know, I guess William F. Buckley's or so on, trying to legitimize their views or give them a platform or anything like that. So so and it's so in that regard, we're kind of like, okay, what's not being written that like we would personally like to see? And it's like, well, no one's writing about this. Why isn't anyone writing about this? This is really interesting. So then we'll be like, okay, this is how we pitch. This is how we solicit writers. And the second part is, you know, I think when people try to apply, you know, try to use their intellectual efforts to critique society or, you know, at least opine on society, that's usually kind of done through this filter, if you will, of, okay, so how does this relate to parliamentary politics? So how do we mobilize voters within a Republican system to like get enough seats and so on and so forth? And, you know, there's a whole lot more to society than that, or even the political in a very, very broad sense. Like I know Marxists use the term political to mean like everything. That's a very expansive definition of the word political in my assessment. But when I think of political, I think of the public contest to gain power, to decide who has power. And basically, I think there's very interesting alternatives to that and how you can really change the course of human social organization. And let's say, let's take a really easy, big example, the invention of the transistor. I think that's arguably bigger than the French Revolution at this point in terms of how it's impacted human life. Maybe not yet. It's definitely bigger than the Russian Revolution. I'd say in maybe 20 years, it's just going to be like unambiguously bigger than the French Revolution, like how it's changed history. So, you know, that's a really like, I don't think, you know, I actually don't know who invented the transistor, but whoever did, I don't think like they're trying like time to change society. They were kind of like doing what engineers do and trying to like take things to a logical conclusion and make something better. But
right, it was in Bell Labs in the war effort.
Yeah, it sounds about right. And so like, you know, other things we're seeing now, it's like, okay, we have like libertarians complaining about the Federal Reserve. So they think, I guess they need to get like fucking Gary Johnson or some goober like that elected and somehow get seats in, you know, the House and the Senate. And then you're going to pass a bill and you're going to end the Federal Reserve. Okay, that's the political way of doing it. You're engaging in the tug of war of, you know, the public contest to decide who has power. And frankly, I think those kinds of people, those libertarians, I have a lot of disagreements with them, but one of the most obvious and like not even like value disagreements I have, but like procedural disagreements is like, man, libertarians are just not cut out for this kind of parliamentary politics. Like, if that's what you're trying to do, this is like a really defective way of doing it. No one cares about this. Like weirdos care about this. Ron Paul cares about this. Who cares? Like, so, but I mean, there are real answers outside of this kind of public tug of war, this kind of deliberation. There's you can build Bitcoin and that's work. It's like, say what you want about Bitcoin, maybe it's like stupid or like fake money, but like that's a way to hedge against our existing public institutions or even private institutions. And similarly, it's like, well, do you want to, you can, if, it's like Albert Hirschman, he had voice exit in politics. This is, many of your viewers are probably familiar with this, but, voice is lobbying, voting, getting out there and picketing and influencing the media and trying to change the hearts and minds. And then there's the exit, and like, fuck this, I'm taking my ball, I'm going elsewhere. And so, that's one side of the post-politics is exit. And then you saw this like Cody Wilson, bad things recently happened to him. We'll get into that. But, it's like, why should we worry about like creating 100 new NRAs to try to like just own a gun and defend ourselves? Why don't we just like, well, why are we asking for permission to do this? We can just do it. Like, and so that's what Cody Wilson did. I think is a very post-political statement. It's like, I'm not interested in engaging in the public deliberation for power. And on the other side of post-politics, outside of just that like sort of exit, which is I think today dominated by those kinds of like crypto anarchist currents, well, you have the other way of politics being over. So you have Bitcoin and Ghost Gunner and whatnot, and you're like, well, politics is over because there's no longer a reasonable way that you can capture like the public deliberation to actually influence human social organization in this way. That's done. Bitcoin's not open for discussion anymore. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not even taking a position on. That's a way stickier. But like that means politics is over in those regards, if those become big enough. And another way politics is over is that if the process itself of like the state, you have a king. If you have a king, what's great about a king is that it's clear who has power. There's no more contest because the king has power. That's de facto and de jure the case. Of course, you could kill the king and you get the civil war. You could have like a succession war, but obviously, like nothing's perfect. Like, but if the king says, the Queen of England's like, this Parliament thing, we're not doing that anymore. I'm gonna invoke my rights. I'm gonna maybe get some friendly people in the executive branch and the intelligence agencies. And this isn't a thing that we have to deliberate anymore. This isn't open for discussion. And so I think those are two things people don't put together very often, like the crypto anarchism thing and the I don't know how to put this, the just deliberation over on the king. Like I think those are very things that are natural, not allies, but it's naturally adjacent to one another.
Right, but you certainly don't think that there's any candidate for the king at this point, right? There's a confusion around
the United States.
What's that?
The king of the United States now.
But the distribution of power within the United States government is itself extremely ambiguous and messy, and there is this problem that where exactly power is located, that's constantly obfuscated, right? So I was just clarifying that you were saying the idea of a king and kind of centralized, super clear authoritarian power of some kind actually can coincide with kind of the crypto anarchist tendencies, but
like the tendencies to squash the idea that the word republic comes from res publica in Latin, or how you pronounce it, and that means a public thing. So governance is a public deliberation, and there are these two things maybe on different sides of it that are like, nah, this doesn't have to be a public deliberation,
right.
But
right.
And so I think an example of going in that direction is actually even the very new Supreme Court in the UK that's only from 2009. It used to be the Law Lords, the House of Lords is the court of last resort. It's still, that's like, there's no real deliberation there. It's basically like the Queen, one of her great officers of state, and then on advice of the Prime Minister, not his cabinet, not the Parliament, and then the Supreme Court itself and some other senior judges. Those are all people who just decide who's going to be on the Supreme Court. And then, so that's really going in a direction of the post-political. That's like, well, there is power. A court wields power. Of course, it wields power over public life. And, it orders public life in a certain direction. So in the very expansive Marxist says, yes, these things are still political. But if we constrain it a little, it's like, well, no, there's no deliberative bodies like the Senate handling that. King of Norway, for example, appoints. Well, let's finish this one thought. He appoints.
I'm just thinking.
He appoints all the senior justices and judges in the country with only the advice of a deliberative body that he personally appoints himself. So it's just like basically his buddies. It's like, oh, who's going to be? And they have the most successful judiciary in the world by like even by like, you know, liberal democratic standards, like rule of law and judicial independence.
Yeah, no. By the way, you can speak as long as you want. I wasn't cutting you off.
Yeah.
I was just
okay. No,
I was thinking.
I'd be happy to hear everything you have to say.
No, it's good. Yeah, no, and feel free to speak for as long as you want. I was just thinking that it's almost like if you have a strong power that is invested with very clear authority, it actually kind of makes it easier for there to be freedom in civil society matters, right? So it's like,
sure,
there is this kind of interesting complementarity between the crypto anarchist and, you know, I'm like basically a kind of left libertarian, really, in a lot of ways, mostly. I mean, I guess my views kind of are somewhat complex, but if you had to peg me, I'd probably be most intelligently pegged as a left libertarian. And, you know, you can make a good case that even from a left libertarian perspective, you would much prefer there to be one strong, kind of clearly delineated,
sure,
even somewhat authoritarian power, but that has, you know, doesn't have to kind of compete or obfuscate itself against like other competitors. It's so strong and clear in its domain, in its authority, in its control, that because it doesn't have to kind of like rely on all these different media games, and it doesn't have to kind of play all of these like cultural signaling games in this kind of complex way that it, you know, you currently see with like the vying for control of the US government. In a sense, it would actually give people, even with like egalitarian missions, kind of like more clarity to create for themselves like what they types of, you know, or like sub organizations that they believe in.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on like, okay, which like if you have like that a kind of like strong, let's say authoritarian, but perhaps just like strong and clear like centralized power, that's got to fall somewhere. So either that's going to fall in that like, you know, the gay people can get married, this isn't open for discussion, or the gay people can't get married, this is open for discussion. And either of those, like, you know, this isn't necessarily a left-right thing, though I think leftists are generally more concerned with the idea of democratizing and deliberatizing. Like, you know, there's a joke about like every kind of like, you know, radical organization, it's like, has to go through 5 committees before they do anything, you know, like everyone needs a voice. So I think like, you're right. I definitely don't exclude the possibility of this being going in the left-wing direction. But I think that just because the nature of, well, first of all, I mean, the left liberals are, you know, hegemonic right now. So the idea of exit is appealing to people who are somehow disempowered, because the idea of crawling up the ladder using the same rules as the guys in the top of the ladder, like, just isn't very appealing. So, you know, like back in the 60s, like the people who were like free speech, that was all like Berkeley students in the 60s. They were all like progressive liberal radicals. The free speech movement was called. But now you have these like, you know, alt-right like shitlords, and like also like the Mike Cernovich types. They do the same thing now, because they're hoping for this kind of like, please let us talk. No. They're kind of sanitizing their shitty beliefs by like, I think, the not very compelling like appeal to like, well, we are evil, but we have free speech, or like they're evil at least by the people in power. It's like, no. Like all they can possibly say, they can't be like, yeah, I'm pro white nationalism, which I'm not a white nationalist, so everyone's clear. They can't say that, but they can say like, no, I support my own right to speak about white nationalism. Like it's kind of sanitized through a liberal lens. But it was kind of a tangent. But I mean, I do think that like, I think the closest you can get to kind of like politics is over within like a solidly unambiguously left-wing system or context is, you know, Lenin took power. And he's like, look, I'm replacing it. It was done with who knows how much of a true believer ideologue he was, or who knows how much. He's just like, look, this is how I'm going to get power. He came very close to having absolute power. Academics were replaced with pro-Lenin academics. Journalists were replaced. Ministers, the heads of the military, you know, engineers running the sewage. Like everyone was replaced that would have any kind of say in what goes on in society. But again, that was kind of, there had to be a proxy argument for that. And the proxy argument was, no, this is the will of the people. We have this democratic centralism that everyone has a voice. So the true voice can be escaped from, like, you know, the false consciousness of like this liberal capitalism. But when you get to right wingers doing that, you don't really need proxy arguments. They can just be like, yeah, it's like, I'm in charge and that's good. You know? So
Okay.
I think, I do see what you're saying, and I think there is virtue to that. I think there's a lot, like, you know, it's in Jacobite, we don't just run right wingers. We've run leftists before. I think
I was going to ask you about this because earlier when I was asking you about it, you described it as dissident right.
Yes.
And I thought that was kind of interesting because, you know, you do have this kind of slogan of being post-political, and it kind of seems like you, in some ways, the public messaging and public branding is kind of trying to not necessarily pigeonhole itself as right wing. And as you said, I know that you have run some kind of left leaning pieces. So if you see yourself as dissident right, or you see the larger kind of goal as dissident right, then what's like the underlying cultural politics where you welcome leftism, or how do you see that?
So I think that the dissident, the short answer, I'll start with the short answer, and that's, I think there's very interesting things that leftists have to say that are adjacent or attendant upon or instrumental to things that this our little like flavor of the vaguely right but certainly dissident like line of thought likes. So there are things that go hand in hand. Like there's some, you know, some parts of some corners of leftism or some corner of any ideology, Georgism, negative utilitarianism, you name it, they'll have something that will overlap with someone else. But, and I would like to clarify though, I think post-politics does lean right. I think if we're talking about like, we're going to look at these organic modes of social organization that seem to propagate themselves naturally without any kind of mass deliberative coordination. Like if you just like, if New Zealand was just separated from the earth, for 1,000 years or something. It just went to its own planet. And they also, in the meantime, everyone lost their memory. All the hard drives were wiped. They kind of lost like culture and, I don't know, things are supposed to believe, things about liberal democracy and so forth, and things about like you have to respect gay rights and all that. They just forgot all that. And they started over. Maybe they started like a Neolithic level. I think we see something very predictable in how their society organized themselves when they came back in like a few centuries. I think we'd see that they supported healthy family structures that social conservatives are very worried about maintaining. These are just forms that naturally fall into place and can survive the test of time outside of external pressure. They're kind of the entropic destiny of human social organization when you take your pedal off the gas. You know, if you take away single mother subsidies, maybe that's not a good idea for social welfare, moral, humane reasons. I don't know. I'm not going to litigate that here. But let's say we did. I have a feeling we would have a lot more healthy family structures, that we would have less kids that, you know, are in need of all these government programs themselves. Like, single mothers, we just know that these kinds of families produce kids who are drug addicted, who are, you know, themselves can't really maintain a relationship, can't hold down a job, and so on and so forth. It's way higher across the board, like statistically significant. So if we just stop single motherhood subsidies, that'd be one little example of taking the foot off the gas. Maybe there'd be a lot of pain, an unacceptable amount of pain from that in the meantime, but eventually people would be forced to rediscover, staying in this example, healthy family structures. Like this is the social entropy. This is where when energy is no longer applied, things just flow down the hill. So I think people criticize the left-right paradigm. I do see merit in that criticism, but I think there is like a bimodal distribution of these ways of looking at human society. And one is like, no, we have to apply energy until utopia happens, and that's the left. And the other one's like, you know what happens when we don't apply this mass coordinated deliberative energy? And
okay.
Yeah.
So that sounds a little bit more like a kind of normal libertarian position. Like we should peel back policies that have unintended negative consequences, because
Yeah,
like a
and
lot of government, like the
yeah,
idea that a lot of government intervention that's perhaps possibly well intentioned has negative consequences, and if you just peel these back on that, that's going to be good. I mean, I'm not. As you said, I'm not going to litigate that either, but that certainly sounds like a political position and a kind of pretty typical libertarian one. Or am I missing something?
sure. Yeah, I mean, well, what I'm sort of saying is that like I don't even believe that like I was giving one example that libertarians would happen to be amenable to,
Okay,
and
right.
I think that like the sort of virtue of libertarianism is, and I'm not a libertarian. I don't agree with them in a lot of positions, such as ways of social conservatives and so on. Don't agree with libertarians. Libertarianism itself is, I think, rather apolitical, even though it does have a very political, like a policy goal angle. I think but in a sense, like what libertarians want is their vision towards organization of human society. I think anyone who thinks about things, almost everyone who thinks about things, like just gets their intellectual hamster wheel going, is going to want to like has their vision of how human society should be organized, for which direction it should go, at least some kind of vague direction. I don't consider, okay, this is a human person and they have like they have social needs and this is where we should go. I don't think that is itself sufficient to call political. I think to be called political in our little sense, and this is, of course, this is always going to be controversial, is our very specific conception of that, how we direct human social organization today. And that's again through this idea of everything must be deliberated. Like you always hear about like Airbnb. It's like hotels don't like that, and like some neighborhoods don't like that, and stuff like that. And it's like, we never deliberated this. It's like, and obviously it's there are like human social organizational goals that this leads to. And
Right.
I think the important thing to take away from it is like, yeah, we didn't deliberate it, and like that's good. This is something that actually like just happened, and that's not even necessarily libertarian. Like, I think libertarians might like a lot of this stuff. They like Ghost Gunner, they like Bitcoin, and they like stuff like that. But I think there's like what is the natural state of these New Zealanders I described that go off into a different planet for 100 years after being Neolithic or whatever. I think they're gonna organize their state power in ways that let's say aren't very libertarian. They're probably gonna have, just like every other human society has, prohibitions on homosexuality. There's gonna be coercive prohibitions on promiscuity. There's going to be prohibitions on adultery. Maybe they're going to execute people for that. So these are things that are very not liberal, that are not libertarian, but are ways that human societies flow. When libertarianism was kind of an outgrowth of a couple like English dudes in the 16th or 17th century who were like, this would reduce violence in our time and place. But like the idea that like liberalism or libertarianism is sort of the zero entropy social state is something I definitely disagree with.
Okay. So it almost sounds like you kind of have what one might call a natural law perspective. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I don't give much weight to natural law, though, so I would agree, like, kind of the vague direction you're coming from. Like, sure, yes. I think that we can look at, because I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'll say this. I view this natural law, I view this as instrumental. Like, okay, there's things that we can look at that are instrumental to other things. I don't think we can look at and be like, no, this is what must be obeyed. I think like what I described as like healthy societies are things that the supermajority of people just happen to like very much. I'm a Catholic, so I derive my moral underpinnings from divine law. But I think there's divine law often, things that we call natural law are map on pretty well, those two things.
Sure, that's right. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I was just curious if you might see it that way. So someone in the chat is asking a question. They want to know, if you voted for Trump? Do you feel like talking about that?
I did not vote. If I was forced at gunpoint to vote, I would have voted for Trump. I don't necessarily.
I did not vote either.
Okay, that's good. I like that. Yeah, voting's stupid. It's a waste of time.
Political, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Voting is just a massive waste of time unless you're in like the swingiest of swing states. Like if you're in a municipality with like 1,000 people and it's like dead 50-50, then voting might be rational. Yeah, I have preferences.
Go on. If you want.
No, that's it. You.
Okay, cool. I was just curious. Yeah, well, someone in the chat was curious. I was curious too. An interesting reflection I had listening to you talk about the political is that I feel like for a while, before the kind of most recent wave of kind of moral panic on the left, and this kind of entire cultural politics that has kind of subsumed the public image of the left over the past few years, for a little while I feel like there was a kind of a consensus on the radical left that was somewhat post-political also. And I've been like quite embedded in the radical left for several years now, and I think back especially to like the days of Occupy. If my memory serves me correctly, I would say the average viewpoint at that time among like my radical left-wing friends was that the entire electoral system is not worth any time or attention. There was this profound and widespread skepticism towards the whole game, and a kind of ethos of, yeah, basically, I mean, in some ways, Occupy did have this kind of like exit ethos to it, and I was very affected by that, and I was very kind of influenced by that, and then I found it very strange when all of a sudden people started getting way more into electoral politics and, the importance of, fighting within the system. And I was just kind of like, that was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I guess what I'm kind of driving at is I feel like there is a latent interest or a latent kind of reservoir of interest in exiting what is widely seen, I think, on the left and the right, like deep down, when you really drill people's attitudes, a lot of people on the left and the right think that the entire political system and the whole game, even a lot of the cultural politics, is this kind of really increasingly stupid game that's not worth anyone's attention or time. I think there's a lot of feeling of that on the left and the right, but I think the left, a lot of people on the left feel kind of held morally hostage to a certain like charade, a certain performance of, oh my gosh, like what you say about Trump on Facebook matters so much for the livelihoods of like poor transgender people somewhere. Like there's this kind of, people are falling over themselves to reassure the people around them that they're like a good person. And that people really, I think a lot of people feel like there are stakes to that. Like, I think there's a fair amount of sincerity on the left. Like, people think it really matters what they say about Trump on Facebook. Like, if they don't speak out about Trump on Facebook, like, it's going to hurt someone's life down the line. And they, I think they really do think that. But meanwhile, there's also this large reservoir of people on the left who don't want to bother with it because it's increasingly stupid and meaningless, just nonsense signaling. But they can't like write for Jacobite because all of their friends would shit on him. Do you know what I mean? So like, I feel like there might be a realignment kind of underway, or maybe on the horizon that's not quite there. It's maybe waiting for some sort of like cascade moment. But I feel like there might be upon us a certain kind of realignment in which like the left libertarian wing, who's currently kind of held hostage to silence, will soon kind of crack and defect. And then like your wing, the kind of dissident right, will perhaps maybe kind of like find some, I don't want to call it common ground because that's like a vulgar kind of that's a term of like old voice politics. Yeah. But you get what I'm saying? Like, I think there could be a realignment in which there's strange new groupings might emerge.
Yeah, I think that, there's two very interesting. Everything you said is interesting. I think the two super points you made that are interesting. One is that I think leftists are more inclined to sort of cargo cult speech and voice or political expression, and I think that's for very good reason, because I think the preferred leftist modes of social organization, either the goals or the procedures to get there, are very much dependent upon either struggle sessions or like implied distributed struggle sessions. Everyone needs to clap their hands and believe, or else this fucking thing falls apart. Like, if anyone's like, I don't buy this, like, that's kind of an existential threat to a system that's held together by like tape and goodwill and like goofy theories. And that's disparaging. I'm not being charitable, but anything that's sufficiently utopian that requires an alignment of all of society, like everyone needs to be in lockstep. Let's say totalitarian. And I think leftism and anything that's dependent or that buys into the tabula rasa theory tends towards totalitarianism. Any of that is very, very concerned about this kind of like public square like hygiene that needs to be clean and perfect, because one stray note, that's a big problem. And so the second, I think, more important or bigger point that you were bringing up is that, I think as, like, let's say Trump gets reelected, let's say it looks like Republicans are going to hold on to the Senate for a while. It looks like there's a good chance that the judiciary is going to be reshaped, the GOP's image. And maybe people like that, maybe they don't. We'll see. But certainly left libertarians or leftists in general will like that. And I think it's this kind of, we're already reaching a moment where the sort of shock and horror that we see from a lot of these leftists, many of them, most of them perhaps even being blue checks, we see that it looks a lot like how those people themselves describe white privilege. Like, a white person is shocked and appalled when there's a temporary suspension of their privilege. Like, for a little moment, the dominant cultural institutions aren't making everything easy for them. And I think that's exactly what is happening with these leftists. And they're like, oh my God, like, what was it? Think Progress got fact checked. It was like the first fact check ever that Facebook promoted that was like not by a left-wing organization. It was the Weekly Standard. It was like center right. They fact checked, like, Think Progress said something like just straightforwardly false about Brett Kavanaugh. And they're like, what? We're being fact checked now? And then there's like this loss of unquestioned power that seems like oppression to them, because relatively kind of is. Like, going from 50 to 0 is probably what you could describe as oppression, but they're going from 100 to maybe like 75, right? But I think this thing's going to become more common to them. They're going to be less horrified as time goes on. They're going to become more sober and be like, okay, it looks like absolute media control isn't enough. Like, these dumb fuck yokels out in the middle of the country still have the ballot box. They can still elect people despite like how much propaganda we're blasting in their ears. And that's going to be I think a wake-up call to indicate more of these people need to do things themselves, like, which is good. That's great. They need to build alternative institutions. They need to try to carve out an exit of their own. And there's ways to do this. Like, okay, you're sick of this corporate like wage slavery. You can build a co-op. Give your workers ownership in the institution they're working for, and that's great. Co-op grocery stores work very well. Maybe there's other co-ops that can work well. You could have, union dominated shops. You could, actually, I was actually soliciting someone. They were very upset about the net neutrality rules change. I'm sure you heard about that. Yeah, and people are very upset about it. I think it's not a big deal. I don't know, that's my opinion, but whatever. A lot of people were, most of them on the left, and they were working on building a mesh net. This is a very, very ambitious project. There's one in New York City, I think, that like is pretty. I mean, because you need density to do this, because like the local like relays, which are these like I think they use these like microwave things. Their distance is about like, it's like half a kilometer if unobstructed. And you just like, you set these up to relate to each other, and you can build your own little like network that has nothing to do with the internet. And so then they were trying, they were thinking of ways to connect this to other cities' internet, so all these people could be on their same like kind of like artisanal internet of their own. With this, the ISPs aren't there to take away your Netflix or whatever. So I tried to get them to write for me. That never materialized. Maybe they saw we were the bad people or whatever, like you said, like their friends would shit on them. But no, I'm very, very interested in seeing this. Like, you know what? We got to do something about this. Like Trump, we can't overthrow him. It's not. It looks like the resistance is kind of a joke. we might have to settle for doing things ourselves, you know? And I think it's very interesting. I'd love to have more people writing about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's more attractive anyway. It's like, even if the resistance,
I agree.
like, yeah, even if there was like some compelling model for how a resistance would actually work, or like how, you know, like, even if I could be convinced by like the DSA or something, or Jacobin, about how, you know, we can establish a functional socialism or something in the US, like, even if I could be convinced of a compelling model of those things, and I haven't been yet, which is why I personally am not really interested in that route. But even if I could, I'm the trouble and the effort and all of the kind of bullshit games, all of the bullshit games that you have to play that are so costly to do that through the current kind of totally broken system that we have, is not worth it. Even if you convince me it was possible, it's just so much better in every way, especially because of kind of the digital revolution that we're still only in the infancy of. In every way, it's just more attractive to just divert your attention away from the center, the big, confusing, distracting spectacle of mainstream power. Just look away and think about how can you more creatively and more intelligently make what you want to see in the world. And I wonder if the, you know, one hypothesis might be that, because I guess the drum I guess I've kind of been thumping a little bit out here on the internet is, as a kind of like left libertarian, kind of anarcho-communist type of person generally, I'm kind of like, I would rather talk with and work with honest, intelligent right-wingers who are like not that evil, like, as long as like they're not actually trying to like do harm to people or something like that.
Right.
I'd rather talk to and work with an actual right-winger if they're smart and they're honest and they're straightforward, and they can lay their cards on the table and make reasonable adult, you know, exchanges and plans. I would much rather talk with those people and try to build some like interesting, effective, whether it be a culture or some sort of like institutional design, whatever it might be. I'd rather experiment on the outer edges of what's possible with those people, and even spend one more day of my life like trying to make sense to like kind of indoctrinated like SJW type. And my wager is that eventually, like, the SJW is going to get so kind of cognitively taxing that if you're at all like intelligent and you still have a pulse on the left, you're going to more and more kind of agree with what I just said. And I'm kind of placing all my wagers on the fact that will eventually, there will be a critical mass of leftists who suddenly start doing things like Jacobite and start reading things like Jacobite. And there's going to be this, maybe the new cleavage. Like, my hypothesis might be that the new cleavage will be something like those who are willing to just create for themselves what they want to bring into the world, versus those who are not able or willing to do that and are trying to like play these ridiculous old games. I don't know.
Yeah, I think an important way to look at it, or important like little like thread to look at perhaps, is you constantly, like, you know, I'm going to compare it to Tolkien's like mythology or meta mythology. Like, is in his stories, evil could only corrupt; it couldn't create. Like, you know, like the orcs that are corrupt, like humans or elves or something, so on and so forth. But you know, and I'm gonna, just a little bit of a Fedora Lord point, but you know, the SJW as you were describing, like we saw the thing with Linux. It seems like they can only have entryism. They can only take what those people who built things that you were describing, who are intelligent and industrious and interested in building things, and they can only go and say, no, you have to let us in and let us be in charge. And then, of course, there's new like doctrines that sort of are sclerotic and, you know, stamp out any thought that can actually create something else from that. Like, and it looks like that's happening in tech now. That's a big thing in tech. And I think that doesn't bode well, because I think tech is one of the great places you can find this kind of like, you know, we're just going to build stuff instead of trying to pump billions of dollars into moving an electoral needle just like half a millimeter. Like, it's because, I mean, compare that to the nonprofit industry in the United States. I'm from DC, where everyone is working in a nonprofit or the government, or journalism, I guess. But like, so much money, so much effort and money, so much intellectual capital is tied up trying to get this tiny movement on this deliberative spectrum, you know? And it's just it's so wasteful. Like, some of the smartest people I know are in these nonprofits. Like, you'd have the most intelligent and insightful conversations with them, but like, their labor is just captured. And this is just because like there's like it's a few things. Like one is a tax code, like 501(c)(3)s, like Canada doesn't have the same kind of thing exactly, so there's not really the equivalent thing there. But also just because like as long as we, at least in our minds, maybe not exactly in reality to the same extent, but in our minds, everything is at stake with like this deliberative procedure, then that's where all these resources are going to go. And I think a lot of it is changing the minds of getting people to know it's like, no, man, you like, why don't waste 3 hours in your Tuesday to go vote? Like, you have better things to do. Like that, you're not. First of all, nothing's going to change at all. Second, like from your individual vote. Secondly, like 3 hours is a lot of time. If you're a decently capable person, like there's something that you can do in 3 hours. Probably different from the guy next to you, but there's something you can do in 3 hours that can like actually have an impact on how society, which direction it goes towards, like helping the human person do what human people are supposed to do.
Right. Now, I'm curious, Robert, do you see the kind of the SJW left that's kind of very high salience right now? Do you see that tendency increasing more and more over the next several years and kind of increasingly spreading its tentacles everywhere, or do you see it like fizzling out?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think it's going to get stronger. And I think that because the normal modes of, like shaming or squashing or isolating people that would that would prevent this thing from snowballing just don't work for some reason. And I think it'll take someone smarter than me to say exactly why. But it's like all of the things, like there's a special kind of armor that these like I call them post-Marxists or college Marxists. Someone else has told me, or SJWs, I guess is fine. Just like various kind of like BuzzFeed type radicals. These are all walking BuzzFeed listicles, and you have the what they actually believe is kind of more retarded than what you can actually like exaggerate to make fun of them. So I think that's actually like a really good defensive attribute. Like all of the normal criticisms of the SJWs or whatever you want to call them don't work anymore because they've become boring and repetitive. It's like all of the criticisms are so obvious that they're banal now. They're insipid. Like, so you just seem like like some kind of like culture war grifter, like Charlie Kirk or someone like that. Like the SJWs are babies and wear diapers. Like that's how all the criticism of them looks now. So there's no criticism left. It's been mined out. And so, but they're still doing their thing. You know what I'm saying? Like it's become obvious and boring, and it's become aesthetically discredited to even criticize these people because you seem like just another like Paul Joseph Watson when you do it. So I think that's a very good defensive attribute. So I think it's going to keep growing.
Well, that's definitely true, and that's interesting. That's a good point. Though, what that leads to, though, is like if you're like an intelligent leftist and you're not into the whole SJW dynamic, you realize what you just said, which is you can't even criticize this anymore if you wanted to. It's so sort of banal and normalized now. What that means, though, is that the sooner people realize that, the sooner they choose exit, right? So the alternative model to what you were describing is precisely because you might be right. You see more and more people choose exit. They choose to defect from the entire game, basically. And you see this, so the alternative possibility would be you see like, I mean, some people argue that we're kind of living right now through quite a renaissance of, kind of radically independent culture and intellectual life. And I was talking recently on the stream actually with Jordan Hall. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's kind of well known. Jordan Greenhall. He used to go by. Anyway, he's like quite an interesting dude and quite a smart dude. And he was saying how if he had to kind of describe the magnitude of the kind of cultural renaissance that's going on right now in terms of free speech and free thought against kind of the status quo that you and I are I think both aligned against. He was saying that this is probably a change about the magnitude of like the Renaissance, or no, I'm sorry. He said the Enlightenment. He said we're probably in a moment of change that's about as big in magnitude as the Enlightenment. And, you know, he's a really smart dude, and that really got me thinking, like, I think that might be right. I think we're just at the early stages of it, but it's happening every day. And so, yeah, I think you could see the whole SJW thing fizzling out sooner than people think, because as you said, it's mostly parasitical, right? So it's they're carving out value for themselves that was created by other people and other times and places. And so, like, when the people who make that value just take their ball and go home, you could see people, like, you know, really losing or dropping the whole, like, SJW model of, like, cultural climbing. It could just run out of steam because they can't get their hands on, you know, like, value to be parasitical on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that I'm new to the Bay, so I don't have a particularly sophisticated opinion about, like, the tech culture here, but I think that tech might be their Waterloo. I think that there's a great deal of preference falsification in tech, because every other, like in DC, there's no preference falsification because it's your job to be like an ideologue, it's your job to be a show. So everyone wears their politics right on their sleeve. But then, you know, here it's like engineers that just want to, like, hey man, I just want to, like, take systems and make them better. But so that means, like, they keep their head down, just, like, do their very interesting and sophisticated work. However, that also means, like, that engineering mindset, I think, also lends itself to looking past present status quo bullshit. Like if you're doing anything, if you're, like, refactoring computer code, like, okay, we can scrap this and redo it. Like, which I think lends itself to a dissident type of radicalism, which means that, like, so in people over here in SF are quiet about it, but if you talk to them in person, I think a lot of them, maybe this is a selection bias because I hang out with a certain types, but a lot of them, they'll be like, yeah, this is crazy, this is terrible. And of course, you're not going to say that if you work at Facebook, because Facebook's full of communists. No offense, but I don't see there being a total victory here, because, like you said, smart, productive people, they don't need this kind of, like, demotic, with a T, not N. It's kind of demonic too, but they don't need that to, like, to a lot of people who aren't good at things, this kind of, like, just getting a megaphone and screaming and then going to the ballot box and making Facebook posts that are angry and criticizing people on Facebook. That's kind of their only plausible route to making a little bit of a dent in the world. But I think people who actually build stuff, there's a way more, like, cost-effective and time-effective and impactful way to do it. So, and I think most of those people, they're not interested in just being like, yes, oh, of course, it's good to cut an 8-year-old's penis off. That's really good. Like, very few of them, I think, they can see past that bullshit. Like, you know, these are, if you do psychedelics or something, just as a different example, it's like what they do, I guess, as Huxley described them to us, at least. It's like, I'm not promoting drug use here, but they'll just, like, scrape away things you're expected to believe. And I think that's kind of a very typical way for the engineer's mind, or let's use kind of a trite term, innovator, the innovator's mind. I think that's kind of how they more normally operate on that kind of, like, scraped away bullshit level.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, something I think a little bit about is how a lot of the sort of SJW types, I mean, your rendering of them wasn't necessarily unfair, I don't think, but, you know, I don't think it's that they're not good at anything. I think that maybe is more too.
That's obviously false.
Right. I don't know if you said that exactly, but you said something that sounded a little bit like that. And I was just thinking, like, I think they have certain traits that don't necessarily get rewarded very well under, like, contemporary techno-capitalism. And yet, because of kind of the role of emotions in media culture and just the games that people can play with each other, the SJW types are they're constituted in a certain way where they don't have the traits that allow them to, like, create tech businesses or something like that. but they do have traits that are good, that are, you know, what they call like soft skills, right? Like pushing people's buttons, you know, to get things that they want. And those traits or those skills do have value. The problem is that they only have value in healthy communities, right? Like they have a role to play in a healthy human community. The problem is that they don't really have a good role to play in contemporary techno-capitalism. And so that's why I'm kind of like, I take a little bit more of a sympathetic view on it, because I'm sort of like, the SJW types, what I see them as is as a kind of sublimated economic behavior. They're trying to, you know, carve out some resources for themselves in a world that is increasingly brutal and increasingly not really hospitable to them. Whereas I'm sort of like, if we want to see less and less of their like maniacal and destructive behaviors, then we need to create communities in which that are healthy, like actually healthy human communities in which those people's traits and skills can actually be valued and rewarded and put in their proper place and in like a functional whole. So that's kind of like one of the lines I've been pushing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in weird experimental institutional designs, maybe, in which you could imagine some sort of arrangement of rules in which highly productive people on a small scale and kind of pool resources with other people who are not so like economically productive, but who can do things like loving and caring for kids and cooking food and doing these other types of things well. Like, I actually think you can seriously imagine arrangements in which those holes are created. And it's kind of communist and it's kind of hierarchical, but it's maybe the truth of human being is actually somewhere between like these molar categories of left and right, without sounding like a, you know, vulgar, like we should all get in a circle and sing songs together type of guy.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very true. And I've actually written about something kind of along those lines. My last article for Jacobite was basically, I looked at the Brett Kavanaugh thing, and I wasn't even taking a position in this article, as we generally don't. We don't really take positions on object level politics like that, or that's not the angle it comes from. But people were looking at it from like, well, either there's three main ways of looking at it. One is that like, okay, this guy's a rapist, or, you know, and then like this brutal and uncaring GOP is not copying with that. Or then the other one is like this brutal and uncaring Democratic Party is accusing an innocent man of rape. And then the third one is, okay, it's both, which I think is a little more accurate than the other two. So, okay, these are both just like partisan power plays. It's just like pure partisan interest. But I think the third is just that we were looking at it from, we were trying to smuggle, I think what you described as these, you know, like in this small scale situations, these kind of like, you didn't use this word, but like, I'd say like benevolent busybody kind of personality traits that are useful in like small, like tight-knit kin groups. Those like have a different epistemology. Like you can have a different standard of truth there. Like if my sister comes to me, she's tears in her eyes and tells me she was like sexually assaulted, she was fucking sexually assaulted. Like there's no two ways about it. But that's because she's very close to me and we have extreme trust with each other. And it's my responsibility to take her for her word in this situation. And I think that's, at this scale, is how, like, I'm going to say a feminine epistemology operates. This is the domestic and the parochial and the personal and the subjective. But I think that's a really good point.
That's a good point. I mean, that's yeah, go on.
I think there's a problem when we try to smuggle this to the largest of scales. We try to take this up to the scale of not only 330 million strangers, but where there is power over these 330 million strangers at stake. When we get there, then like we can't use this kind of epistemology that's, I think, native. It's not 100% native to women or 100% alienated for men, but it's a kind of a bimodal distribution. That's something that's more feminine, which I think is why this resonates a lot with women. That just can't work because you can obviously game systems that way. So I think this is kind of similar to what you were saying. Like these people have skills that make sense for like in like family, very close friends and associates situation, which is that humans evolved in those situations. It's only since like industrialization where like that isn't the normal and important and valuable scale of human organization. So I think there is kind of like an alienated anthropological and I think very feminine uh, ethic going on there. And I think obviously a lot of men have this too. I think kind of the two groups we're kind of talking about are the systematizers, who are very much less the SJWs, who are like, believe women. Well, obviously you can't build a system out of that. There's problems here. Like the autistic systematizers, like, this can't work. You can't always believe a woman. But like, you know, but then that's callous. If your daughter comes to you and says she's sexual assault, it's like, well, I don't know that. Like, that's obviously monstrous. So I think the systematizer versus empathizer, and which is often, I think maybe this is uncharitable or wrong. I think SJW males are more in touch with their feminine side, at least in this sense. They have a more feminist mode of reasoning, or not feminist, feminine mode of reasoning or epistemology. And I think that that gap is really hard to bridge.
Right. I think that's plausible. I think it's quite flexible though, and plastic. I mean, I've known people in my experience on the radical left, even myself in my own experiences. I've known people change. I've watched them change a lot through cultural conditioning. You know, I mean, it's kind of ironic because, you know, the idea that we're all socially constructed, you know, I mean, we're obviously not all socially constructed, but when you have a strong kind of treatment applied, when you have an intense kind of social community really telling you very strongly to think or feel in a certain way, we are quite plastic, you know, at least in the short term. And so, like, I think a lot of the males you talk about, like male feminist SJW types, you know, they probably were much less feminine before they started being subjected to intense kind of cultural conditioning that now is like quite widespread. And I mean, I've known people who, when I met them and we were buddies, they were pretty normal, fairly masculine, kind of average masculinity males who, after like getting socialized into SJW circles, you know, in a matter of a couple years, started really kind of identifying as queer or maybe even trans, and you know, their body change, their body type kind of changes a little bit, their demeanor changes in ways that, like, you know, can be quite intense. And I think their sincere kind of experience of their own subjectivity actually can change, I think quite rapidly. I'm talking about fairly extreme, I think, treatment conditions, if you will, to use social science language. But so that's probably not representative, but I've kind of seen some interesting cases like that, I think. And so all I'm really getting at is, you know, I think a lot of the kind of like male feminist hysteria that you're seeing, which frankly, like, I mean, I actually count myself as something of a feminist. But like what today is called like male feminism is often just like cowardice. It's just males being pussies who have no courage.
Independently come to my own conclusions.
Yeah. And so all the point I really wanted to just drive at is that a lot of the kind of, especially like the male lack of courage and the male kind of just mushiness that you see today, kind of masquerading as sympathy and support for women, I think it actually you could see a change radically, like, and quickly. If there was a corresponding kind of cultural change, if the SJW kind of social pressure cooker were to significantly decrease, I think, you know, you could see a lot of people become way more healthy quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think a problem there is, I hope I'm not going off on too much of a tangent, is that
go for it.
I'm very much, I don't consider myself a feminist. I very much am worried about the well-being of women in our society, though, because I think that there's kind of a dual, there's these dual, I guess, to go off what you were saying, like intense social conditionings that are just like forcing people into unhappy contortions. One is that, like, okay, to be a good woman, you have to be just like a man. Like your value system is being as close to a man as possible. Like, we no longer value, at least in like cool BuzzFeed, like, she's a badass because she does drone strikes in Yemen, right? Like,
Yeah.
like it's no longer like she's a badass because she has like this powerful humility where she can just like without expecting thanks like do important things in this community or like for even for her children. Like that's no longer put on a pedestal. And other things like, yeah, she is big at JP Morgan, like that's all you can look forward to, and that's all you can derive status to from, really. And I think that's against the natural inclinations of women. The other one is I think that women are unhappy when men are weak, like you described. Like that, I think everyone's unhappy because it leads to this general disorder and indecisiveness. And you know, I think like the problem with what you were saying, like there's a social context where a lot of these people were describing their attributes and skills are kind of disenfranchised. They're left holding the bag, so to speak. Uh, and I think that's true. The problem is, I think the society they're trying to build, for whatever reason, is going to be more disenfranchising. There's going to be more
Yeah.
closeness replaced with alienation. Like all we're going to have to look forward to is the world becoming one gigantic strip mall with like atomized, depressed, Prozac dependent wine ants who are told to never have children. You know what I'm saying? Like that's gonna create these things, these atomizing trends. That's gonna accelerate these atomizing trends, which are perhaps inevitable, but it's gonna certainly make them faster. It's gonna make these people more and more alienated, more and more trying desperately to stave off nihilism. And you know, if we want to bring back closeness, we have to bring back the anthropological logic of gender roles. Like gender roles, like the idea that every woman was unhappy before like 1955 is obviously insane. And you know, it's like we also didn't have people who were like constantly like dependent on Prozac. Like, you know, I don't know. This is just a tangent, and I think that this is
No, it's okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we see things too differently. Like I'm more or less content to call myself a feminist just because to me all that means is that there's going to be some number of women whose unique kind of personality attributes are mismatched for the
totally
traditional
true.
gender
Totally
roles.
true.
And so I support their freedom to do whatever they want for the most part on their own choice.
Right.
Yeah, but I also would affirm that for most people, the traditional gender roles are going to be the best choice. I mean, that's just they're here for a reason. Like we wouldn't have certain traditional gender roles if they weren't relatively quite effective in sustaining life and community and reproducing itself. So yeah, I mean, that's all. I think that's like the basic reasonable feminist position is like if women want to be different, that's fine. Let them be different. But let's like I'm definitely against the kind of current feminist trajectory or tendency that wants to basically act as if you know women are like all women are completely equal in every possible way. Because I agree because I agree with you that it's doing at least as much harm to women as it is to men, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what you said about this massive social conditioning, I think that's the culprit. Like, you know, that's like you're conditioned to feel that your values that, you know, you actually hold are wrong, and you need to replace them with like this kind of like careerist consumerism to be happy. And I think trying to tell people have different, just like completely alien values, you're not gonna have a good time.
Yeah, I sometimes feel really bad for like I can't imagine what it must be like to be a young teenager boy right now, like trying to date, like trying to get laid in like the current in the current culture. Like what kinds of mental gymnastics and physical performative gymnastics does like a 16-year-old or 17-year-old young man have to think and say and do to get laid and or to even just like date or whatever. Because at such a young age, you know, you'll say and do whatever the culture around you says you need to say or do to get the girls. And I just imagine like I would like to read a good like ethnography about this in kind of the age of like peak SJWism, because it's got to be tough.
I mean, I've heard the statistic. I cannot vouch for, you know, how true it is, but it's a 25% of teenagers in California that identify as non-binary, which I
Whoa.
think I mean, who knows? Maybe this is bullshit, but
Sure.
and I think that only translates to like they act exactly like a normal boy would, but they say they're non-binary, because like that's cool or whatever. So I don't know. I think that might be part of like this like Darwinian reproductive strategy play. It's like, well, I mean, fitting in. It's like I think women are very conscious of social status and defectiveness in mates. I think they very much look for that, which has the secondary effect of, I think, causing men to be like, well, fuck, this is what I got to do, you know.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. It sure looks to me like, especially in youth, like young urban adult culture, there is like the male status hierarchy is now kind of like how sophisticated a like SJW feminist can be. It's like that's what
Mhm.
they're selecting for, and I
Right.
think for young women, it's very thrilling to see men kind of do all of these linguistic acrobatics
Yeah.
to prostrate themselves as male feminists. But I've also seen, and I seriously, I've seen this play out in people's lives and people I know. Like it's thrilling, I think, for young women at first, and then eventually
Mhm.
they realize they've actually cultivated like a very kind of weak man, and then they end up like leaving them or cheating on them with like some bro. Like I've seen this kind of happen before. um and so yeah, I mean it's interesting to see like how that's going to play out in the long run, but I guess that's
Yeah.
all just speculative.
I think the saving grace for men is that, at least in this very small regard, this is obviously isn't that much of, I think, a world historical problem or issue. But I think that because for men, um, dissidence signals mental fitness in many situations. So if you say, like, I think differently than the herd, that I think that's often attractive to women. But obviously, there's people who try to like do that fumblingly and look like fucking idiots, like dumb hipster douchebags. But you know,
Definitely. Oh, I think you're right. I think you're right for sure. um it's different. It's interesting though, but I think the problem is that when you're a really young man in your teenage years or like young early 20s or whatever, to be like a dissident is really hard when there's like literally no other pocket. Like
right?
usually to be a dissident, you at least have a few people to kind of like rebound onto, like friends, like close friends, for instance, or close family. Like you need some minimal place to recover from when you go against
Hmm.
the herd. Do you know what I mean? I think
Definitely.
what we're seeing now in today's culture is it's so claustrophobic, it's so all consuming that like young men who kind of know what you said, which I think is absolutely right, that like the best way to get girls is to be the badass who thinks for yourself and says what is seems true to you no matter what, and dissent. Like they're not even able to access that space because it's like they can't see or hear or smell any space in which from which they could do that.
They could draw
So I
strength.
don't know.
Yeah.
Except the
Isolation is
internet. I think the internet is giving
right.
them that kind of, yeah.
Isolation is a super powerful tactic to crush dissent. If you think people are the only, like, I have this like, horrible thing gnawing at the back of my head and I'm alone in it, it's pure evil. Like that's the easiest way to get someone to like to neutralize them.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
think obviously it shouldn't be like a mystery as to why there's such a campaign to define down harassment into meaning, like on Twitter, to mean like saying the not good the having the bad thoughts, having the bad opinions. That's because if like the kind of the floodgates have broken in kind of a rather postmodern sense that like the authorities are kind of dead. They've been dethroned. Like, and that's, as much as like Jordan Peterson criticizes postmodernism in this very ham-fisted, characteristically ham-fisted way. Um, he's kind of produced by postmodernity. Like
Hmm.
this like no one is a gatekeeper anymore. And I
Right.
think that's kind of a threat to this kind of tactic of isolation. And I think what we're seeing is that well, you have these typical modes in a liberal democracy to exercise not absolute power, because you can't do that in a liberal democracy, but exercise, hegemony. And 50 years ago, you'd have a few editorial boards, and you have ABC and NBC and the New York Times. They would dictate the what the country talks about.
Mhm.
And that kind of worked. And I think there's a problem, because it looks like, there was never the level of just like concentrated like heat ray of bias than there was when we saw in the 2016 election and during the Trump presidency. It's just been like straightforward advocacy journalism, and the positions that were being advocated for were anti-Trump and pro-Trump opposition. Like if you were a Republican, it's funny. I think it was Dave Weigel of the Washington Post, in fact, that tweeted this. He said that like there was this poll that came out, because there's the idea that like Trump wasn't the real Republican. The real conservatives didn't like Trump because they were the good ones. But it turns out 96% of self-identified conservatives in the country supported Trump. And then the joke Weigel made was the other 4% go on cable news. So like anyone who could disagree with Trump was elevated this way. Like it was like, oh, Bill Kristol, like he wants your kid to be transgender, but like don't worry, he's really cool about bombing Iran. He's the good conservative. But it turns out like this just wasn't enough. And I think this is like weird. This is kind of like the weird unquestioned loss of power we saw, where like this cultural domination isn't working. Like this is going to be like an existential crisis. And I think in addition to what we were talking about before, to loop it back there about like the people on the left being more and more amenable to these exit-oriented strategy of actually building alternatives themselves rather than relying on lobbying the people in charge. I think that's going to be a trend, but I think also people are going to lose faith in, like, we've been comparatively lucky that our ruling elites, who are like, I'd say left neoliberals, they're like the neoliberals of the culturally left flavor, they've been contented to just control the means of representation. But that's not working anymore. So I think they might look to control other stuff too. They might get a little more Leninist in their outlook. But
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, since you're an editor, and as an editor, you kind of have this, I presume you must have a sort of view of kind of the culture and especially sort of the intellectual ecologies and the different, you must pay attention to who's writing stuff where. And I imagine you're kind of you're always trying to scout for talent and stuff like that. I'm curious if what is your read on academia? And kind of the battles you're seeing right now over academia. You hear about more and more cases of people like Brett Weinstein who kind of get pushed out, but then they're just and Jordan Peterson also, then they just do their own internet thing. And in some ways they have more power doing that. Are you watching all of this and thinking about that? Do you have a read on like what is the current state of play with academia and where you see that playing out in the larger like intellectual ecologies that we're kind of all in?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with my most uncontroversial opinion on this, and that's that I think so. Most of the humanities are compromised. They are run by just like these kind of left neoliberal radical and other kinds of communists who just want control. But history is actually really great. Like we have more and more tools. We have like new genetic tools, new statistical tools today. We're just like, history is just getting better. And history is kind of inoculated against this like parochial, narrow-minded view of just like being a good party man and just like, putting things in the direction of the party's goals. It's inoculated against that because you have to put yourself in the shoe. I'm sure you're an academic. A historian has to put themselves in the shoes of the person in a time and place of what they're studying. It's like, I'm not going to judge. There's the person who made the human sacrifice comment. Do you remember that? It was a big shitstorm about it. It was like an academic's like, maybe Aztecs, some of them wanted to be sacrificed. And a bunch of right-wingers criticized him. It's like, this is cultural relativism. In academia at its worst. I'm like, no, this is what historians do, and this is why it's actually inoculated against this kind of radicalism. It's because you have to put away your personal baggage, and you have to put yourself in the time and place. Like, this is what they believed, and because most people believed things in history that were comparatively sober and radical compared to our like kind of consumeristic bazinga BuzzFeed overculture. I think that's very good. But in terms of you know, in terms of like building alternatives to academia, I think there's some really promising stuff out there just because of the economics of it. Like, it doesn't look like college is getting any cheaper. Any like idea of just making college free is like just fucking from a from a fiscal standpoint, that's just not going to happen. That's like many times more expensive than like all our wars in the last 20 years combined. This is like, we can't just stop going to war and pay for college. That's ridiculous. So I think we have these like these sort of alternative negotiated certificates, like, or certifications rather, to signal that you're not defective. Because what college right now, maybe you disagree, I very much, Jacobite interviewed Brian Kaplan about this. He has a new book. Actually, the title escapes me right now, but it's good. I've read it, and then I interviewed it. It's basically about how education is mostly wasteful, particularly higher education, because all it is a positional good. If more people get college degrees, that doesn't make society better, because all that does is put them in a position at the same or ahead of other people with college degrees.
Right, which is like, why now you have to have a master's degree to be considered educated.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, and I think here in San Francisco, it's actually comparatively sane. Like, there's people who work at tech companies that don't have college degrees. I think that's really cool, but they have to signal competence in other more difficult ways. But the fact remains that most of what education is signaling. It signals that you are, you know, not only like there's the most cynical types of signaling that I'll talk about, like, and that's like, you know which fork to use, you know how to write a letter, you know how to be polite and deal in an off, like your parents probably wore ties and went to work, you know how to like, you know how to interact in that social sphere, you're not an outsider, you know how to use Microsoft Word and stuff like that. It also signals that you can sit down, shut up, you're at least good at tests. You have some kind of intelligence.
Delay gratification. Yeah.
You can delay gratification. That's mostly what it tells people. And that's important. And but the problem is more and more people do this, as we expand sort of the degree franchise, so to speak, all that does is intensify the defectiveness signaled by the people who don't go to college. It's like, wait, everyone's doing this now. Why didn't you? You seem like a weirdo or there's something wrong with them. But I think there's some hope spots, and I think this could. I know I'm not exactly answering your question.
No,
but
okay.
and the hope spots are these alternative certification organizations. Like I interviewed the founder of Lambda School, which teaches very specialized computer science skills like Android development.
Right.
I guess they're that specialized. Yeah. And they seem like they're great. And you know, some of these boot camps have gotten criticized for not really teaching like the meat and potatoes of computer science, because you can't compress that into like a 6-month online course, which I think there's something to that, but I think that's inevitably going to happen when this is like such an embryonic like venture. Like, yeah, people are going to get things wrong, and we're going to get people, like some of the people certified aren't going to be exactly what they need to be certified in. But I think like we're going to move, just because as college gets more expensive, as it becomes more and more like frankly useless, you're going to have people who try to instill themselves with skills in other ways, and there's going to be a slow, but right now, because these certifications don't mean anything to classic degree conscious employers, but I think as they become more common, that's going to less and less signal defectiveness, just because it's going to be normalized. In terms of like, you know, the Weinstein or Weinstein, no, it's Weinstein. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
No, I think it's Brett Weinstein, and Weinstein is the Hollywood dude.
Yeah, it's Weinstein. Weinstein. That's it. Okay. Yeah. You know, I think there's kind of like this. We get the sense of like first of all, I think a lot of these people, a lot of them have interesting things to say. Some of the things they say aren't so interesting. I'm gonna reserve judgment for now, at least. But I think the interesting part of this is like the sort of horror you're seeing at what they're doing is the horror of the librarian no longer being the gatekeeper of knowledge when Wikipedia comes around, you know? Like,
Yeah.
remember in high school, you probably like Wikipedia, that the devil's work. You can't, no Wikipedia allowed. It's like, you just go to their citations. That's what I did. But anyway, you know, and it's the same kind of thing. It's like there was actually a pretty good system of control where like, you know, journalism is downstream from academia. Things that were in academia 15 years ago are like in the BuzzFeed listicles now. Like, you know, cisgender, that word. And that's a good pipeline to have for journalists. And journalists, part of their compensation is being able to control the conversation. They like it. It's frankly good. It makes you high status. It's fun. And journalists don't get paid a lot of money. So the gratification they get is being able to be powerful culturally. And same with academics. I mean, academics ain't more than journalists, but you know,
Yeah.
you're not going to be like a Google engineer. It's not going to be making that much money. So I think you're also, if you lose some of your compensation, some of your ability to put your fingers on the scales, and you know what we're doing here right now, trying to push society a little bit in the direction that we prefer, they're not going to like that. So I think, you know, there's a natural sort of immune response to these kinds of people, but I can only see it like this, like just not only is the technology is here, I think more present than that is that it's clear that this is a thing you can do. You can do what Jordan
Right.
Peterson does,
Right.
and so on and so forth. And no one was really able to stop you. People can shit on you. That's about all they can do, though.
Yeah, I think your diagnosis is really apt, especially what you said about how there's this horror at it from people within the institutions. There's a certain horror at the Jordan Petersons and the Brett Weinsteins because if it is actually a viable pathway to defect from the institutional game as a whole and go it alone completely independently. I mean, if you've invested your whole life into basically like compromising your thinking, compromising your speech and your behavior to have this, you know, what you thought was a guaranteed kind of platform of status
Right.
and social respect and influence, and then all of a sudden it turns out that the social reality is different than what you thought it was, and there's actually a pathway for someone to just say fuck it and go rogue, and all of a sudden they don't just have the same amount of status or influence as you, but they actually have more. There's like, I think you're absolutely right that horror is one of the popular emotions. And just because, I mean, I've kind of seen it a little bit firsthand, like in my recent, the recent kind of nonsense that I've been going through. Like, it's been really interesting to note. I don't know how much you've been following or whatever, but basically I got some flack from I got some flack online for like using inappropriate language or whatever. And it's really funny to read like my mentions, how many random academics from like whatever, like Bodung University, message me to say that like I should be ashamed of myself, or you know, all these like just I mean, it's not usually that intense, but it's usually like some kind of condescending message of you know, condemning me in some sort of vaguely like moral or ethical register. And you know, yeah, it's hard. I basically have the same read on it as that you have. Like that it's a kind of like, it's a horror at the very possibility that maybe one of their own just doesn't really feel like being constrained by stupid rules, which all academics will talk about like privately at the pub. You know, like all academics will talk about privately about how, you know, how expectations are unreasonable and this and that. But then in public, there's this kind of like hand wringing that everyone has to do. But it's hard for me to avoid the inference that at the heart of it, there is a kind of horror of how cultural power is shifting right now, I think.
Do you think?
I mean, go on.
Do you think that there's become more like, because the academia, there's kind of, compared to like other let's say fields of human life or disciplines, there's this kind of like academic freedom. Like professors can say what they want. They have this platform. That's what academia is for. They have this platform to be a free thinker. That's always how it's kind of been. But do you feel like that's becoming less the case? And that's why this kind of exit is happening with these people like, fuck it, we're going to go to a platform where we can have these old, perhaps never existing liberties that we cherished or we look back on.
Well, so I have this kind of hypothesis that I think over the past few decades, because of the acceleration of and the increasing kind of efficiency of kind of global techno-capitalism, in large part because of the digital revolution, there's been stronger selection at work in many institutions. And so that's a kind of overarching hypothesis I've had for a while, and I've kind of laid this out in some of my classes actually that I teach. But basically, it looks to me like all institutions, including academia, but other ones also, whatever it is, whatever traits that they are looking for the job, their ability to find those traits exactly and to select those traits and to, filter out people without those traits or with more complicated mixes of those traits has increased. So selection pressures have increased, I believe, in many institutions. And because of that, in the academic context, I think what that means is that over the past few decades, academia has just been importing into its ranks more and more tightly well-behaved people.
Yeah.
So the norms of academic freedom have more or less probably stayed, but who gets to enter academia has become radically more constrained. So there is a kind of radical narrowing of academic freedom, but it's not by censoring or policing anyone.
Right.
It's by increasing selective pressures to ensure that the only people who make it to a tenured position are highly predictable and reliable representatives of a very, very, very tiny niche of thinking and speaking and acting.
Right.
So I think what happens is, if you're someone like me, I'm kind of an anomaly in terms of like my class background and my personality constitution. If you're an anomaly like me and you kind of get in and you figure out a way to kind of play the game and climb the ranks somewhat, you suddenly find yourself with a major problem on your hands, because you realize actually to live in this sort of highly selected, constrained environment, you have to be constantly like policing yourself. But it's interesting because it doesn't play out in terms of like big academic debates. It's not like I have some big research project that they don't like me doing because it's politically sensitive, although there's a little bit of that. It's more just like you have to be a very, very narrowly constrained type of person. And so, yeah, in a weird way, it kind of avoids the debate about academic freedom. Like that's kind of been obviated.
It routes around that, yeah.
Yeah, and that's my read on the larger dynamics there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me from what you said that like maybe like the official standards haven't changed, but like the soft standards, because standards only exist inside the head of the people who constitute these institutions. So if it's being selected more for like keep their head down or like busybody sticklers, I think then like the unofficial standards have certainly changed. Is that about, you think, right? Is that?
Sure, I think you could say that. I think it just takes place at a different level or a different stage in the process. It's not like certain types of research agendas are prohibited exactly. It's just a certain type of person is more rigorously selected, and then there's all of the kind of soft socialization forms of censorship that I think are quite they're definitely heavy. I mean, conservatives in academia, the small number of conservatives in academia, there's lots of ethnographic data about their reports, and they leave academia because they find it inhospitable. There are some conservative political scientists whose work I've kind of read for some time, and there's no doubt that there are political biases in what type of research gets rewarded to a significant degree. I mean, that's a very rigorous form of, that's a problem for academic freedom for sure in some sense. But there's very little explicit kind of censorship, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
There was a question. Oh, unless do
no,
you have
go
something
ahead. Go
else
ahead.
on that, or
No. I would love to hear a question.
yes, there was a question earlier in the chat about how apparently was there some kind of beef between Jacobite and Douglas Lane at Zero Books?
Yeah. One of his former writers, who's great, Nicholas Hausdorff, has written for us a few times,
Okay.
and yeah, I mean, I don't actually know enough about it to give uh, a take on it that wouldn't fan the flames more. But I mean, I think it's just what we're seeing. It's like, wait, this guy that we once gave a platform is now saying the wrong thing, and
So
it's like,
break it down for me, if you will. What did he say, and what happened? What was it?
I mean, it's just there's a podcast. I watched a little bit of the podcast they had together. I mean, part of it was the guy running the podcast, not Nicholas Hausdorff, Douglas Lane, edited it, so like it was deceptive. So it sounded like Hausdorff was saying things that he wasn't. Kind of like a
Okay.
classic shit you just like shouldn't do. And because I mean, and which is particularly weird. Obviously, I'm gonna take the side of like Hausdorff because like he's great. He's a great writer. But I mean, it's just like a weird thing to do if you like invite someone, like, because the sort of like tension had already existed before that. But then this seemed to be like an olive branch he was extending. Be like, hey, come on the podcast. Let's just talk about this. Like, no, no big deal. And then, at least from from what Hausdorff told me, that his words were just taken and like chopped up, and yeah.
Okay. So what was like what was the like controversy or drama? Like how do people know about this? So what
I mean,
happened? What was the fallout?
controversy. The controversy. The only thing I know is through Hausdorff, and he just told me, he's like, yeah, my old editor is all pissy because, as he described it, like he's writing for a right wing, or I don't know, neo-reactionary. He described it some way like that. Publication, and he turned his nose up at that. I think Zero Books perhaps is some kind of like Marxist thing. I wish I knew more about this, but
Okay, so you don't know like that much about the whole story.
I don't know the nitty gritty about it. I know the abstract stuff, the high level stuff.
So someone is clarifying actually in the chat for me that Doug Lane thinks Jacobite is a reactionary mag and that reactionism is antithetical to Zero Books. Okay. Yeah,
I mean,
whatever.
That sounds about. That's he's not
yeah,
like
but
he's in the right direction.
Yeah, you're not offended by that, obviously. But you did say that you think of Jacobite as dissident and right, but
yeah,
you see like certain aspects of leftism can be welcome under the umbrella.
I mean,
so it's not. I mean, it's not like you're like opposed to the left as such necessarily.
Yeah, we're not like opposed in all things to like all leftism. I think that's like just frankly intellectually boring. So no, we're not that. So, but I think that kind of openness, like, yeah, I'll have someone who identifies as a communist or at least has a Marxist mode of social analysis. They're welcome here if they have interesting things to say on their own merits. I don't think that kind of openness is symmetrical with like most people on the left. I think they're like, well, shit, we don't have to abide these people. We have this we have a robust and toiled within, like we can get as much as we want. It's like shit on these guys is like all the problems. That's all we have to do. And there's a lot of like social incentive mechanisms, I think, to make that the case. But like, even if I wanted to just be like, yes, fuck the leftists, if I just wanted to be like a dumb propaganda, like affirmation machine, if I would probably pay the price for just being like a rabid ideologue in the ways that like Zero Books is not paying the price. Because but but I think to bounce off that, I actually have a question for you. And wait, I just forgot it. It's good. Let me try to think. Oh yeah. So there seems to be some kind of like just forming connective tissue between like academic or intellectual, like something within the ballpark of Marxism of exasperated people who have toiled within that status quo and are like, this is all mined out, because like Marxism has been sort of, there's been this weird mapping on from Marxism to intellectual, like a one-to-one mapping. It's like, if you're a Marxist, you're intellectual, and intellectual means Marxist. That, you know, I think that it's just so, it's so like heavily treaded that there's just so many less interesting or clever philosophical angles to take it in, that it seems like people are exasperated by it. Like people who are traditionally on like the academic left or like that kind of left are like, maybe there's like other things to offer in that like forbidden section of the library over there. Do you get that idea? Do you think there's something, is this growing? Do you think it's more present than it used to be?
That's a good question. Whether it's growing or not is one question. Maybe I can reflect on that in a minute, but I could start, I guess, with what I know best, which would be my own experience and trajectory. And I would say that in my own trajectory, I think when I started reading kind of some of the more radical right-wing kind of thinkers who are popular today, like Nick Land and Moldbug, and I started reading all of that stuff like with a lot of interest. I got really into it for quite a while. I still read some of it, and part of it was just boredom. Yeah, boredom with all the left-wing stuff I had read, and I think especially when you're like told by your like peer group like what should be read, you know, like what needs to be read, what books you need to be aware of, what books you should be thinking about. Anyone with like a genuine intellectual tendency, immediately their mind is immediately going to go to like what you're not supposed to be reading. I mean, I think that's just a natural thing for if you're an intellectual, you're curious. You're curious, yeah. And so it's like you want to find out what's going on. And so I think what for me, yes, it was partially like, I think you kind of alluded to this, that when the culture sways in a particular direction, and I think, you know, the Trump election shows very clearly that almost all of like respectable mainstream culture has quite a bias toward a kind of respectable progressive kind of attitude. When the whole center shifts sufficiently far to one side, it just makes sense that the next nuggets of insight that are being neglected, that an enterprising young intellectual can find out to the greatest effect, you know, the most profitable next discovery, and I say profitable not in a monetary sense but in an intellectual sense. It's just going to be the case that it's more likely the next big insights that everyone else is failing to see or grasp is going to be hiding somewhere on the other side, or at least closer to the other side than the center of the herd is, right? So I think that's I kind of think that this is what Nick Land meant when in my conversation with him recently, when he talked about how he thinks there's a certain kind of cyclical pattern to when, you know, when a radical intellectual might take a kind of left-wing flavor or a right-wing flavor. He said something about how he thinks there might be something cyclical to it. And it wasn't obvious to me what he meant when he said that. But after thinking about it, I think this kind of might be what he meant, which is that, yeah, like whenever the center goes too far one way, it just makes sense that if you want to radically prod at what everyone is missing, if you want to look for what everyone is missing, you're going to go in the other direction. Right. And that doesn't mean I became like a right winger, but I guess it's kind of like what you were saying. It's like I had to kind of disengage from my perception of myself as like the Marxist mold. Right. And I had to kind of like try on for size, like a somewhat more like right sympathetic kind of like state of mind. Yeah. And I'd imagine in contexts where the right is more ascendant, you know, like I think like, you know, it's trying to think of a good example. Like, I don't know, maybe an example would be like post-war, like French radical leftism or something, like after the experience of, you know, the occupation and Pétain, you know, maybe like in a certain type of context where the overriding feeling is like very reactionary, then like a left-wing kind of mold makes sense for like most radical ideas that could be expressed at that time or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if does that answer your question at all?
That does answer it. And I do wonder, it's kind of a to alley-oop off the last question. Do you identify more people maybe who are like have a
Right.
visibility in the internet who you think are this kind of exasperated like connective tissue between like let's look over here, let's consider this in good faith.
Right. That was your other question. Like, do you think it's going
Yeah,
to increase?
but I mean,
Or
do
how's
you
that
know
playing
if
out?
I mean you said you're not sure about that, but uh, a sort of separate question is like, are there people thinkers you'd identify as in a similar like situation as that, like that you
Oh,
could
that's
point
good.
to?
Good. Yeah, good question. My honest sense would be, I'll say a few things. My one sense would be, I think a lot of current academics are pretty genuinely content with the current kind of reign of SJWism, kind of moral righteousness. Like, in other words, I don't think that there are many currently kind of tenured, established academics who have a kind of personal, secret set of truths that they're just dying to be more frank and explicit about exploring, but they're afraid to because of social pressures, and that maybe, if the conditions change, they would suddenly express their radical secret interests and feelings and thoughts. I don't think
Mhm.
there's much of that. So
Mhm.
yeah, and that goes back a little bit to what I was saying about the increasing of selective pressures. I think
Mhm.
anyone who's like a young tenured academic, for the most part, an overwhelming majority of them, they're there precisely because they genuinely are quite content with the
They're party men.
the status quo ideas. Yeah, so I would not expect a model in which you see kind of mass defections from academics towards a more like radical kind of space. But I think one thing you could see, however, is as the kind of we're kind of in this sort of like kind of witch trial moment. There's kind of like an arms race of like accusativeness and moral righteousness, and
Mhm.
I think you could imagine a model where in the near future, like as more and more like innocent people basically get accused of like crazy shit that they're not
Mhm.
really like
Yeah.
they're not
Yes.
very guilty of, that could maybe trigger some kind of like major um like change of mind or change of orientation among
Mhm.
people. But honestly, even that I'm not so bullish on. Like, I don't know if you looked at this recent news article about the the shitty media men controversy. Without going too much into it,
Yeah. Yes. The union rubber stamped management's decision to fire this guy.
very
Like
strange. And like the
that's
men, like
bizarre.
there were men apparently who they say that they were wrongly accused, and also that they support the accusations.
Right.
Very,
Sure.
like out of the greater good or something like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I would not put my money on major defections from current academics. However, the other question was just are there people out there um, who are currently or maybe about to be kind of like breaking the equation between like intellectual and Marxist. And I'm trying to think. I would say I would look towards people in grad school right now. That's what I
Mhm.
think about. Like, I think smart young people in grad school who aren't like fully formed as, like as their intellectual career has not been fully kind of cemented, or their mindset and their orientation has not been fully cemented, and they haven't been, they're not established yet. I think you'll see more and more of the smarter graduate students kind of sniffing things out and saying like, uh, if I have two choices, like the profession or being myself on the internet, you're going to see more and more smart people
Yeah.
from the graduate moment defect off. So you're seeing lots
Yeah.
of cases like that. So like one example would be like Oliver Traldi. Does he ring a bell?
Yeah.
Oh,
He,
he
he's
wrote for
he's
you.
right.
Yeah, he wrote for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a piece
He's right.
in Jacobite. He and I are kind of friendly on the internet. Like, he's a PhD student, very smart, probably very
Mhm.
capable of like succeeding in academia. But I feel like people like Oliver Traldi, increasingly they're going to choose to not go into academia, I think, and they're gonna create new ways of living more intellectually freely on the internet. Who else? I'm trying to think if I know. I mean, there are a lot of people right now, I think, who are students, either undergrads or graduates, and they're very smart and they're anonymous avatars.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the things I'm kind of trying to do with this live stream. Like I talk with a wide variety of people, like above me in status and below me in status, because like I think right now you don't know where intellectual value is hiding right now.
Exactly.
And
because
so
maybe it mapped on. Maybe it
Go on.
mapped onto status before, like, okay, this guy is well respected. That means he has good things to say. But I think that's definitely different now.
Absolutely. I think there's a major, it used to be, status used to be fairly well correlated with intellectual value. And now people are realizing the correlation is way weaker than people thought. And so kind of the underwriting kind of the strategic wager of like my current kind of internet project, especially around the live stream, is like, I can kind of use the cheapness of digital communication and kind of use quantity to make up for this like search problem, basically, because like if you're willing to take a little bit of a hit in status, like, yeah, I talk with lots of people who don't have status, and some of my professional colleagues might look at me and be like, oh, Justin's a loser, he's talking with these people who are not famous or whatever. Like, but if you're willing to take that little bit of a hit in status, you can so make up for it in terms of quantity. Like I'll just talk with like 1 million people a year, and if only like 20 of them are like super fascinating geniuses hiding in the shadows, then I come out way on top in terms of like the intellectual value that I was able to find and create and everything, So I think there's a model there that what people will more and more figure out how to exploit. And if I can think of anyone else more specifically, I'll let you know. I mean, I think you're seeing like, oh, go on. Yeah.
Do you know, I don't know how to pronounce it, Anna Kachian, or do you know her? She seems to be going in like an exasperated, she's obviously like solidly read, but she seems to
do a podcast?
She has a podcast. She's big on Twitter. Yeah, that's it. And so
I don't know her personally.
Okay, but I mean, I don't know her personally either, but she just seems to have like an exasperation with like the typical like taboos and sacred cows, and you're like, like families are good, like this is like I don't know. So she seems to be more and more like willing to like break the mold, but like I don't know, still keeps her leftist stripe somehow.
Interesting. I've seen her around, but I haven't really looked into her stuff. But so you're saying she's based?
She is based in Red Pill, my friend. No, I mean, she doesn't. I don't agree with her on most things I'd say, but she seems to be willing to like say things similar to you. It's like, yeah, like these old social modes of organization like are human and humane, like the love between like mother and child and husband, like these are all like very very valuable things. Like she doesn't put it in those words, so maybe I'm misrepresenting her, but it seems to be things that would like be at least a little bit aligned with things that I've heard you say.
Okay, like you get the sense she's not just like towing the line of some like leftist catechism.
Yeah,
cool. No, well that's useful, because I'm always looking for like interesting people, but sometimes it's hard to tell who's who, and you don't want to like invest a lot of time trying to figure it out. So I think another thing I would say is like, I mean, I see Jacobite as kind of like playing a role in this search process. Like that's how I kind of see it. Like I think you asked me if there are other academics who are kind of like defecting from the party line, and it's kind of hard to think of many, but I feel like there's now kind of multi-pronged, decentralized search effort going on where people are trying to find like who are the cool, interesting, valuable thinkers and creators out there who are not, getting sucked in and distracted by like the bullshit institutional game. So I feel like Jacobite, like that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in Jacobite and why I pay attention to Jacobite, and why, I'm generally, even though I don't agree with everything in there, I'm generally sympathetic to the project, because I see Jacobite just like I see kind of like similar to Quillette. Like obviously you guys have different brands very much, but like I see these as what they have in common, what these different projects have in common, and kind of my project too, in a sense, is just creating a little tent and then using it to try and go around to sniff out like where is their value hiding, and to give it a space space to breathe,
Right.
and then
It's
see
like
what
who is
happens.
undersold. It's like, kind of what I mentioned at the beginning. It's like, why isn't this been written about? Like any given topic, like, or any given thing. It's like, why has no one heard about this like really compelling idea? Um, and
Right.
I think the status game is an interesting part of it, because I think that it's actually an alternative, like what you're doing and what I think Jacobite is doing, of just like, what, we're going to forget about status and just like publish people who like say good things, or say interesting and intellectually powerful things. When you do that, I think you build kind of the infrastructure or the reputation to get high status people to take a second look at you, like maybe come on, because I think, like, we've had some relatively, like, in the pipeline. We certainly have. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want to jeopardize it, but we have pretty famous and well-known folks who are going to write for us, and some who have written for us. And I think those people are just like you and I, in this fact, like, they like things that are intellectually refreshing. Like, yes, this isn't the same old thing. They're actually like capitalizing on these undersold ideas or these undersold people. And so that's kind of the conscious strategy I've had for Jacobite, to get it legitimized and get it to. I'm not trying to appeal to everyone, but I want to appeal to um, big people, important people, people who I think are worth having their minds changed. So I think that's kind of the hope of any serious project that's trying to do something besides dump $1 billion into a nonprofit, into like a mass media company, like those kinds of propaganda machines, is to influence people on top.
Right.
And I think that people are kind of more and more like, okay, this is what we have to do. And consider the people on top are people on top now are the ones who like were kind of raised on the internet. Like a lot of the people, like, they found these intellectually idiosyncratic communities. Like here in the Bay, the example I'll use, like Less Wrong. I'm sure you've heard of that. It's not
Sure.
really a
Yeah.
thing anymore, but like the spirit of it kind of lives on. Like Scott Alexander's blog, Slight Star Codex, and like he has like really, really like powerful devotees. Like in his comment section, you can even see like it's like important people like Patrick Friedman, and like even like Steve Saylor will go at it, or he and Steve Saylor will go at it. And I think because he has the kind of same intellectual openness that you have. It's like, yeah, Steve Saylor, he's something approximating a white nationalist, but Steve Saylor's got like, I mean, the guy is intellectually something to be contended with. And so I think because Scott Alexander has the same kind of ethic as you and perhaps I do, that he sees the value in that.
Yeah. I mean, a quick little statistic I think you'll be very interested to hear. I actually just talked about this on the stream last night, but not everyone would have caught it. It's people have really incorrect models about like where cultural power is actually distributed. I think you'll really like this, and you'll maybe not be so surprised, but it's interesting to hear. Like, people imagine that, getting written about in like one of the mainstream media newspapers or whatever, millions of people see that. If they say something about you, everyone's going to think it's true about you. And it's like super influential and important. The idea of like getting a negative article written about you in a mainstream rag, that people think like that's like really important and really influential.
Yeah.
Whereas like if some blogger mentions you, like, who cares? And it's been really interesting. Like, I have Google Analytics on all my websites. I'm like a data nerd, so I know exactly how many people are reading what on all of my stuff. And in the past week, I've had two experiences like not too far away from each other, so it's an interesting case comparison. I was fortunate enough that Scott Alexander linked to one of my blog posts. Okay, that was one event. Just one link in a much larger article. It had nothing really to do about me. There was just one link to one of my blog posts. And about a week later, the Daily Mail wrote an article negative about me. And I was featured in the headline of the Daily Mail. And if you look at the traffic that was driven to me, to my name, like how many people looked me up or went to my website or whatever, one link from Scott Alexander was more than 3 times influential than compared to having a headline about you, a sensational headline about you in the Daily Mail. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's very inconsistent with what most people have in their minds as like the model of cultural influence. So we're power is distributed in very weird ways now that people don't really understand. And so yeah, I completely agree with your kind of strategic orientation to like you don't want to be aiming upwards. Like you don't want to try to be influencing upwards. Like you want to be aiming like to the people around you, to the people like that are actually like the large numbers of people that you actually have genuine communicative linkages to.
Yeah, and you know, Scott Alexander's linked Jacobite too. Once in one of his just link roundups, and another time he just did a whole article that was kind of something of like a response or spin-off of it. And I mean, I noticed later like big like you know, I think one of the crude numbers that the traffic that directed is that I think put us on the map for like these kind of intellectually curious or perhaps disenfranchised like big people in tech, like big tech moguls. You know,
Okay.
at least one got in touch with one of my friends, and they like who's in a position where you know networking is good for him, and who's written for us, and you know that just like that's sort of validating. You know, it's like oh shit,
Mhm.
I'm not just doing something for like random like you know 2,500 NPCs like to use the meme
Right.
like a day. These are real people like with real like you know heterogeneous like places in life and like heterogeneous things to offer. And it's not just a matter of like just like trying to get it out to the herd, you know?
Definitely, definitely. And you know what else I think is another thing people often don't see is that when you're competing within a kind of institutionalized like prestige hierarchy, like academia or like mainstream media or whatever, you're not allowed to experiment with or have conversations with people beneath you in status. Like if you do that at all, it's seen as um, it has a negative influence on how people see you and your
I've
future
heard
prospects and
examples of this,
opportunities.
yeah.
Yes, so basically, like when you're in an institutional prestige hierarchy, you can only ever climb up, and you can only work,
Mhm.
laterally at best with people above you, and anything less than that is, it hurts you. It hurts your prospects basically, and that's really, really dysfunctional and counterproductive when, as we acknowledged before, status and value has seemingly never been less correlated. Like if
Mhm.
there's a lot of value lurking in people who have been neglected in terms of status out in the world, there's so much value, intellectual value hiding out in the world with people who don't have institutionalized status. That what it basically means is that institutionalized prestige hierarchies have basically handcuffed themselves so that they have no way to actually go and participate in all of the heterogeneous value that is out there and the readers that are out there and the interests that are out there and the organic intellectuals that are out there. They're like
Mhm.
they're self-prohibited from even participating in any of that. Whereas like
Yeah.
for you, for Jacobite, for me, for anyone with a kind of independent exploratory in project that's purely kind of on the internet, there's no penalty to spending some time looking into anyone. You can give, if you have an article written by like one person who maybe ends up being not that smart or has low status or whatever, like it doesn't hurt you. It's like maybe you might end up wasting a little bit of time on people who maybe aren't worth that much time, but there's no like positive penalty. No one's really going to care.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
this asymmetry in internet politics where it's like if you have a blog and the first 50 posts are total utter bullshit and like no one pays attention to them, but then you write one post that's really good and gets people's attention and respect, no one is going to really say like they're not going to downgrade you because of those first few posts that they didn't like. You get
Mhm.
rewarded on the internet, you get rewarded for what is valuable, and whatever is not valuable, the punishment is really just you get ignored for that stuff, for that part
Yeah.
of it. And that
Yeah,
it's a
that's a good
beautiful
point.
it's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier. It's like, you know, it's like Jacob, of course, you know, we have stronger pieces and weaker pieces we've run. But like, and you know, I my before I moved here to SF, I had a journalism background, and it's like no, you like every like people can use the bad pieces against you, in like kind of that it's more institutional settings, you know.
Exactly.
But you know, it's like that doesn't quite happen. It's like we get rewarded for the good stuff, we get not rewarded for the bad stuff, and that gives us a pretty reliable indicator of what we should have more of, you know?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's like a really beautiful kind of asymmetry in being an independent kind of, content creator or whatever you want to call it, that, it's really empowering. It's because it really enables you to take risks and to just go experimentally and to find what works. And it's very, very regressive when you're in this institutional prestige hierarchy where, you're basically punished for anything that even looks like it's maybe not prestigious. So
Yeah.
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 So, dude, I recognize we've been talking for quite a long time now. You're probably
2 hours.
tired. I'm running out of steam too. So
Yeah.
this has been really fun, though. I mean, is there anything that you wanted to, say that we didn't get to yet?
I guess all people out there. So we've been since the beginning. We want a print edition. That's been at least a prospect, and we are getting closer. A few things have to fall into place. We have to get. It's been mostly out of our pockets up until now. Actually, the Patreon, we're actually breaking even more or less now with that. But
I wanted to ask you about this stuff anyway, so don't feel bad about you're not plugging. I wanted to know how are you guys doing, by the way, and is it going well, and what's next for you? I wanted to ask you that anyway, so please do tell.
Yeah, financially, it's like we're stabilized. It's actually funny. Like when I was unemployed before I moved to San Francisco, I was somehow I just had like really low expenses. I was just like, oh no, I sold all my crypto. I had cryptocurrency. So I was just on unemployment, and I was like paying writers that way, man. It's like but now it's like we've got enough people who are kind enough, who believe in the project enough that they've gone out on a limb and are supporting us financially. And so now, we have enough to break even with that, which is it's really nice. We don't have to and we're breaking even in a way where we don't have to just haggle the hell down in people's rates. We still have normal tricks like magazines generally do. It's like if even AmCon, the American Conservative, if you send them a draft, they don't pay you for it. So we do that. We have to do that. If you negotiate it beforehand and they're like, I want to write this, then we'll pay you for it. Just like this is how magazines generally operate, unless you're some kind of big shot. But yeah, so we do things that normal institutional magazines do. But we are doing well in terms of just being able to continue on. We're not going to die anytime soon. But we're sniffing around for ways to fund, because it takes a pretty penny to get a print issue out, and we wanted to make it nice. We want to make the construction of the magazine beautiful. We want to get professional designers on it, putting it together. We want to get cover artists. Artists, they got to eat. That costs some money. We want beautiful cover art. And we want to get the highest quality stuff from the highest quality people in the print edition. So there's a reason to read it. So we might be we're looking for grants from institutions. We're looking into that. We're talking to people privately for money for that. And we might do a Kickstarter. So I know other projects like this, it's Viewpoint Mag, and there's Current Affairs. They've done the same thing. They got enough to do what we need to do. So yeah, keep an ear out, listeners, because we're trying to be legitimized. Eventually the dream is Jordan and I, the two editors, we just use on our free time, which is hard because editing takes a lot of time.
Oh yeah,
if you want to do good edits, it takes time, and it's good. It's a hobby. It's a labor of love. But eventually we want to hire maybe a part-time managing editor who can just do the dirty work while we look over the more grand strategic things. And obviously that takes money too. Maybe once we have an actual product for people to buy, reason to have an income more than just the goodness of the hearts of our readers, that will be more of a reality. We don't plan on putting ads on our magazine just because that's stupid. But no ads are going to be on the website ever. Maybe just a single banner ad that's tasteful and within the aesthetic. But yeah, so hopefully we're getting a bigger profile. More and more people will know about it. Even people in person, it's nice. Oh, you're Robert Mariani. Oh, what? Yeah, okay. So which it's all glory to God. I'm not concerned about being famous or having status. But it's just this is sort of validation. Okay, I'm not just wasting my time here. But so yeah. To sum it up, we're looking for spring 2019 is when we're thinking of having the first print edition.
Okay.
That's tentative. It hangs upon finances and just people who have committed to writing, like actually getting us the writing. It's harder than you'd think. That doesn't that very often doesn't happen. So yeah.
Awesome. I'm really
If
glad
there's,
that you gone.
if there's any other questions in the chat, I'd be happy to hear them. I don't know if there's any more.
Oh yeah. I'll watch out for questions if anyone has questions about Jacobite going on right now. Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm glad that Jacobite exists. I think we need more and more Jacobites. And what I
Thank
mean
you.
by that is not just like Jacobite, but different flavors of it. You know, like I
Sure.
see the different outlets. Like I sometimes tell people that you know, Jacobite is like a darker, edgier version of Quillette, or like an accelerationist version of Quillette. And what I mean by that is like obviously there's this massive hole in the market, which is basically everything that kind of mainstream like progressivism does not want you to think about or talk about. And now there's this kind of gold rush really to fill that space. And Quillette is doing it for a certain type of person with certain temperament, with certain accents and certain emphases. And I think you're also filling that space for a certain type of person with certain accents and emphases. But I think there's still a massive, much larger space. I think there's like, you can imagine a bunch of different outlets, just like Quillette or Jacobite, with all different types of like personality, accents and styles and tendencies. I think it's only beginning to open up. And I think, yeah, I hope that more and more people kind of create independent projects like Jacobite and like Quillette. And like, I mean, that's like what I'm doing in my own weird, personal, idiosyncratic way, you know?
Yeah.
So,
I think what you're doing is really great too. I've liked your internet presence in general. I wish you the best. I hope things work. I hope academia doesn't squeeze you too hard.
I mean, thank you for that, Robert. I appreciate it. I mean, my attitude is sort of like, if you just promise yourself to always say and do what you want to say and do, and you are confident in your own code of ethics, then you just let the chips fall where they may, and you don't really have to worry about it too much. Like, I'm not acting like super tough. Like, obviously, you know, the society and different institutions can fuck you, and you want to avoid like big stressful headaches. But I think one of the greatest benefits, and it's a selfish benefit, one of the greatest benefits of just like prioritizing at all cost your own intellectual conscience and trying to keep your, you know, public activities as well aligned as possible with like your actual deeper inner beliefs. The greatest benefit of that is that when shit gets crazy and you have different pressures and stressors kind of like fucking with you in an intense way, you can kind of just ignore it and just wait to see what happens and trust that like wherever you pop out is going to be the right place that you should pop out and that you actually want to pop out. So I kind of see it as like, I'm letting the current state of institutions tell me where they want me. If it's academia, that's fine. I'll succeed there. And if it's not academia, that's fine. I'll navigate and pioneer whatever outside of academia I need to pioneer. And I think, if anything, to be honest, my leaning at this point is to leave academia anyway. To be honest, I mean, I'm not. I don't have a grand plan, but I have a lot of hypotheses and possible ideas for like how an academic, like an independent. So you think about it probably more in the model of a you know, a publishing outlet, a magazine, and I think about it more in terms of like the individual model, like as an individual person who wants to live an intellectual life. How should you conceive of that, and how should you plan that, and how should you sustain that and fund that? I have a lot of hypotheses. For how I think like an academic such as myself can carve out a new niche, a new way of funding themselves and sustaining themselves. And I'm just basically experimenting with that. And as my grandfather says, he was a golfer. As my grandfather says, if it doesn't work out on the first 9, I'll adjust on the back 9.
Yeah. I think, you know, the last thing you said, it's like carving out your own space, one that actually makes sense for you, and not like worrying about just like the life distorting like energy required to actually change the institution. It's a very Jacobite way of looking at things. And so
Absolutely.
that
Yeah,
resonates with me. But yeah, no, I think that there is a providence in life to just living authentically, to
that's right.
being aligned with what you're naturally interested in and good at, and your natural inclinations. There is a providence there, and I found it
Hell yeah.
myself. Like I was fired as a journalist, and now I'm working a way better job here in San Francisco. So yeah.
Hell yeah. All glory to God.
Yeah.
Hey, Robert, thanks again, man. This is really
Yeah.
interesting. Good to get to know you a little bit and hear about your projects and kind of look under the hood of what you've been doing. And yeah, thanks for hanging out with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to speak in real time to people. So thanks,
Yeah,
Justin.
man. You got it. Maybe we'll do it again
All right,
sometime.
have a good one.
All
Bye.
right. See you later, Robert.